see if I can make part 2 of this video to where it's short enough to where we can get some of this on YouTube. Trying to remember where I left off, but anyway, when I select a property, the very first thing that I do is once I get a state that I'm focused on, I'll start looking at places away from the metropolitan areas. Although some of my better spots have actually been really close to metropolitan areas because they tend to get overlooked. But typically I try to get as far away from those hubs like Dallas-Fort Worth or Oklahoma City or Little Rock as I can and look for YMAs that are kind of remote. Once I do that and select 2 or 3 YMAs that I want to focus on scouting for not hunting this year, but for the following year, the first thing I'll do is I'll go grab some topography maps and some aerial photographs. A lot of the land that I hunt is actually flat land, so topography maps really don't help a whole lot. Most of the little rises and the little nuances as far as elevation, you have to find by boots on the ground. You're not going to get it from a topography map. But aerial photographs definitely help. And the first thing that I do with my aerial photographs is I look at the YMA, and the very first thing I do is identify where's the access points. Where can the normal everyday hunter drive into, park, whether it's along the side of a road, whether it's a bridge, whether it's a parking lot, where can they park and gain access to that property? And I'll go ahead and mark those, and I tend to stay away from those. Unless there's like a big open field right next to one of those areas with a little clump of trees in the middle of it that might get overlooked. But typically I stay away from where people are going to access. And then I start looking at the surrounding area. I want to look at the private property that's surrounding that YMA. And what I'm looking for there is I'm looking for any kind of crop fields that might be present, plowed fields. I also look for maybe ditches or fence lines, brushy fence lines that point back into the public land. I'm looking basically for any kind of travel corridor from any kind of food source back into the public land. Because what I have found a lot of is that typically a lot of the timber and brush is over harvested on the public or the private land. And so the deer wind up feeding there, but they actually bed on the public land, where there's typically more of the natural habitat, high weeds, brush, and all that kind of stuff. So once I get a good look at that, now I start narrowing it down. Okay, what particular area in that YMA am I interested in? And once I do that, then I will start color coding my maps, and I'll go over that, and then I'll cut this video off so we don't make it too long. But basically what I do for a scouting trip, now I'm talking about this is the first time I'm going to set foot on the property. What I look for is the typical things that you'll hear most people talk about. I look for points, I look for elevation changes, I look for any kind of water source, I look for saddles if I can find them, I look for pinch points. I look if there's a major body of water, I'll look for what I call oxbows or bends in the river and creek, places where deer typically bed. But what I'm trying to do is identify travel corridors and bedding areas. And I mark them up. And how I do it, I'm a military planner, so I don't do anything haphazardly. I plan everything out. So I will actually color code my topography maps, and hopefully you'll be able to see this. But what I'll do is I'll use a blue line to talk about, because I'll go for all day. This is going to be my morning route, okay? So a blue line is what I'll draw in the aerial photograph to go through all the areas that I want to look, whether it's a funnel, a travel corridor, a bedding area, potential oak flat, something that piqued my interest that I want to go see, and I make sure that my blue morning route goes through every one of those spots. And then I'll actually get on Google Map and take GPS coordinates for the center of those and make sure I load them into my GPS so that I can stay on track. Once you get out in some of these woods, you can get turned around pretty easy. So I use a blue line for my morning. I'll use a red line for my afternoon, because typically what I'll do, if there's a creek or a lake, I'll scout one side of it the first day or in the morning, and then I'll have lunch somewhere along the bank somewhere. And then I'll walk either the creek or the lake shore to the opposite side, and then I'll have a PM route that I'll want to go check out all the areas on the opposing side. And once again, I use a red line to identify that. I then circle all the potential bedding areas that I think bucks would use on that aerial photograph in a yellow. And I make sure my blue or red lines go through all these. to indicate any kind of funnel or pinch point, I'll put a yellow star on my aerial photograph. And once again, this just helps me to get a visual of how I want to scout that property, because not all land's productive. You can spend a lot of time walking through a lot of unproductive land. And sometimes I still walk through the unproductive, but I'll slow down and I'll go really methodical through the areas of interest that I've highlighted on my map. If I don't see the tracks, if I don't see rubs, if I don't find some scrapes, licking branches, if I don't find beds in these areas, I move on. If I do find adequate sign, there's no real way to tell what the age or quality of a buck is by tracks or rubs. I mean, you can get indications. If it rubs chest high, that's probably a pretty mature buck. If the tracks, what they call 4 fingers or 3 fingers down here in Texas, is a pretty good sized buck, you can kind of get an idea of the body size of the deer. But that don't always necessarily equate to a big rack or an older deer. It could just be that deer's got good genetics and have plenty of food that spring and winter. So that's what I'll do, is I'll mark all these maps up and I'll plan my route. And once again, hopefully you can see this, how I did that. And on the back, I have the GPS coordinates listed. I'm not going to scan that though, because this is actually a spot. I said I wasn't going to do it, but this is a spot I'm going to go check out 20 January. So once I get this big map, then I'll do the same thing. I'll print down some micro maps of the areas I've highlighted and really go over the yellow lines are the lines that I think they're bedding in. You can see here where I've circled a couple bedding areas. So I really get into detail on these. And what I try to do is I like to get a summer or spring with a lot of foliage on my overall map, because it just shows the detail better. And then when I zoom in, I look for an older fall or winter map, because this really breaks things down. For instance, this area right here looks like one big clump of trees on this FAR scan. But when you zoom in on that area, which is this map right here, you can see that that's not actually one big clump of trees. There is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 islands off of this point. Now this is a big CRP field, but it's the same thing as if you're hunting marshland. Those clumps of trees out in the middle of this sea of 4 to 5 foot high grass is where these bucks are typically going to go, especially down south where they're always looking for shade. Even during hunting season, very seldom you're going to see a buck sit out in the sun all day long. They're going to look for some kind of shady spot. So these little areas like this, especially off of these points, are dynamite areas. So once again, I'll mark these micro maps up. I'll put the funnels on there. I'll put the travel corridors through there. And I'll plan my route to go through every one of those areas. If there's a creek or a river, I will physically walk both sides of that creek or river, checking for crossings. Crossings can be one of the best places to catch a buck, especially the last week of October and the first week of November when they're really cruising heavily. Bucks are like human beings a lot of times, and they're going to go through the nearest and the easiest route to get between bedding areas. And when you got a creek with high banks, they're going to find the easiest place to cross, provided it's not disturbed or not. There's not a lot of pressure, or they don't perceive a threat there. So this will wrap up the second video. Video 3, I'll go through more detail on what these areas each look like. There's plenty of resources out there that talk about what to look for. The bottom line is, you got to have a plan. And when you identify these key areas where you really think the deer are going to congregate or travel through, you want to slow down. I perform almost like a grid search sometimes in these bedding areas. Typically down here, our bucks don't bed in one bed over and over again. They might have a 40-acre spot that they'll bed at various locations with different winds. We have so many fallen over trees. If you was to stop and try to scout every fallen tree in a patch of woods, you would be there for months, because there's just that many, and it's always changing. Our trees snap with the wind down here quite a bit. But what I do is I identify those points, elevation rises, those areas adjacent to thick cover where the deer has good visibility, those prime buck bedding areas, and then I will slow down and I'll methodically grid search those. I don't find a lot of hair in the beds, except for there's 2 times a year where down here I find a lot of hair in beds, and that's when the winter fall coat's being shed, and then once again when the summer coat's kind of shedding off and the winter coat's growing in, you might find bed. We have so many rodents and they're active all winter long down here that the hair just don't last long. Same with antler shed hunting. You do find sheds. I mean, there's no doubt about it. But to go out and purposely search for sheds down here is really hard to do, because the squirrels and the other rodents around here will cart them off and bury them, or actually consume them within weeks of the time they're dropped. So you got to be really specific on the time. Like I said, you do find the carcasses in the racks every once in a while, but man, it's nothing like when I lived up in Montana, where man, I could find 5 or 6 sheds in a good day of shed hunting. Down here, I'm lucky if I find 1, 2, 3 decent sheds a year. So big difference here. Anyway, this will wrap up video 2. I've got some plans this weekend, and then 20 January, you saw my plan there, I'm going out scouting, but I'll try to get video 3 posted sometime in the next couple weeks. Thanks for watching.